So last time gave this talk, I got booed and heckled in Toronto. Yeah. So and my in-laws are from Peshawar, from Pakistan, and when they boo and jeer in Pakistan, it gets pretty violent. So my mother-in-law was saying, "Don't give a talk on Ukraine." Yeah, she's worried for my two young sons. But indeed, I mean, I think that this has been a very difficult time to be an analyst during Civil War. I think that it's really hard to be balanced. Because on the one hand, I feel like as a Ukrainian specialist, you have to admit the fundamental truth that what has gone on, the Civil War, the war, has been because of Russia, that without Russia's incredibly aggressive behavior, you would not have had the Civil War. That's if there's a villain in this story, and the villain is Russia. At the same time, the Civil War was the product of domestic events in Ukraine and Euromaidan, which is also true. And that is a very difficult truth to sort of articulate without getting booed by one side or the other. And in fact, my good friend Christian Freeland wrote this op-ed piece about a month ago about how this is not a civil war in Ukraine, but a Russian invasion. But in fact, if you look at civil wars across the world, almost invariably it's both, an invasion and a civil war. This is very common. And so the question also is, we're thinking back about the domestic conditions. People were predicting civil war in Ukraine since the early 1990s. The question is, why did it happen now and not earlier? And I think one of the reasons is because the Ukrainian elite formed an accommodation, what might be called a pact with the devil, or a Faustian bargain, whereby the Eastern elite was given a stake in the Ukrainian central government. On the same time, the Ukrainophiles sort of moderated their more radical elements, but also got some sort of basic support for Ukrainian national symbols, Ukrainian language. And basically what you had in 2013, 2014 was a breakdown of this bargain. And to understand why this broke down, we first have to note that Ukrainophiles, or pro-Ukrainian elements, until 2014 were incredibly acutely self-conscious about not overplaying their hand, by not sort of alienating the pro-Russian side. And it's really useful here to compare the Orange Revolution to Euromaidan. Now, the Orange Revolution, what was striking about the Orange Revolution, as someone who was there at both, is that the Orange Revolution, of course, was very top-down controlled and not very spontaneous at all. But it was also very self-conscious about its symbolism and not using symbols that were nationalist symbols at all. They were completely absent from the Orange Revolution. The use of orange was, sort of an empty vessel to which you could, impose your hopes and dreams. Even though the Orange Coalition, of course, included many radical nationalists. And furthermore, the big difference was that they decided, there was a kind of major decision point right after the demonstrations began on November 21st in Ukraine, where Yushchenko unilaterally had himself sworn in as president. So he almost went the Georgian route, or the Euromaidan route, by seizing power right away. And then whether it's because of his indecisiveness or I don't know what, he backs down. And they realized, Lutsenko and others, and Taras Tsetsky, that if they did that, if they seized power in late 2004, that the East would perceive this as a sort of nationalist seizure of Ukraine and would create civil war. Fast forward 9 years later, they do exactly that, and civil war. And I think the hard part about dealing with when we sort of analyze Euromaidan is that there are a great number of heroic elements and a spontaneity that you did not see in 2004, which is truly inspiring. But it's that very spontaneity that, and the very fact that basically it was a leaderless revolution, that meant that there was much less awareness of the need not to alienate the other half of the country. Thus, you have the widespread use of symbols that, at bare minimum, are quite divisive within Ukraine. This does not mean that the people protesting were extremists necessarily, or certainly not fascist, but it does mean that they basically made it that much easier for someone like Putin to take advantage of what went on and do what he did. In other words, of course, Ukraine did not morally deserve to be invaded, but certainly the opposition during Euromaidan made it a lot made Putin's job a lot easier. And really, the decisive moment was, I think, the breakdown of the Party of Regions. Now, the Party of Regions, since the Orange Revolution, basically what's interesting is that during the Orange Revolution, the Kuchma's government used a kind of polarizing strategy where they tried to portray Yushchenko as a fascist, nashisti. Now, that actually didn't work in the sense that people just didn't believe that this guy Yushchenko was a fascist. And so people continued to support him. But it actually worked in the East, this polarizing rhetoric, and it basically solidified the support for the Party of Regions. So the Party of Regions within the East in the 2002 election got 17% of the East. After the Orange Revolution, got 60%. So they became the overwhelmingly dominant force in eastern Ukraine until 2013, and that just completely disintegrated after Yanukovych left power and created a power vacuum which Putin was very happy to fulfill. So the question, if I may, is what could the opposition have done to prevent that? And I think a lot of it was basically outside of the opposition's control. That it's in a sense not the opposition's fault necessarily that that Yanukovych's regime disintegrated, right? It's not in their power to keep Yanukovych's party whole. But I do think there was this mistaken belief that was repeated a lot in the West that Euromaidan represented the whole of Ukraine. I mean, even the notion of civil society is this idea that this represents society. I think most of us realize that's not the case, but within Toronto, that's a very controversial statement to say that Euromaidan did not represent all of Ukraine, but the polls are very consistent in showing that. But this belief led them to sort of not to make accommodation. So what should have happened was, and what I thought at the time should have happened, was that when Yanukovych got in that helicopter or whatever, left Kiev, that you should have had the creation of a government of national unity. That this was a collapse of power, and that what you have in response, you have a government of national unity that includes both pro-Russian and Ukrainophile elements. Instead, what happened was victor's justice, in the sense that you had a government which was profoundly unrepresentative of Ukraine. Now, whether that was the decisive factor that motivated Putin to invade, I don't know, but I think it certainly possibly could have changed that outcome. So therefore, to summarize, I think that it's important to realize that that while Russia is the villain, Ukrainian domestic events really, that invasion was not inevitable at all, and that it was really a response to domestic events in Ukraine.